July 10th, 1940. Paris, France. The city's skyline was a strange blend of history and heartbreak, its ancient stone buildings silhouetted against the gray, unfeeling sky. The clang of German boots on the cobbled streets, the sharp murmur of foreign words, was becoming an everyday sound. Georges, only 16, was too young to enlist in the war, yet he was already caught in its current. He couldn't escape it, not when the fight had already come so close to home. Georges watched the soldiers march by with a hollow ache in his chest. His two older brothers, Pierre and Alain, had enlisted months before the German invasion, their idealism a stark contrast to his own innocent ignorance. At first, it had felt like an adventure, something noble and necessary. They'd talked about bravery, about fighting for the future. But as the weeks turned into months, their letters stopped coming. Pierre's letters had been filled with tales of camaraderie and hope, until the last one arrived, stained with the ink of a man who knew he would never make it back. Alain's letters were always more guarded, a man hardened by the realities of war, the kind of man Georges never wanted to become. And then, like a final breath before a storm, there were no more letters at all. Georges had felt the weight of that silence with a young man's rawness. The boy he had been, wide-eyed, curious, optimistic, had been replaced by someone different, someone determined. The war had taken his brothers, his sense of safety, and the world he once knew. In its place, a harsh, chaotic new world had been born. The German soldiers, their uniforms slick with the authority of their regime, controlled every corner of the city. But more dangerous than their presence was the creeping fear that gnawed at Georges every time he walked through the streets of Paris. The resistance, the hidden fighters, the ones who defied, who whispered in the shadows, had become his lifeline. He wasn't yet old enough to enlist, but that didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. His brother's fate would not be his, and his own survival was no longer just about his life. It was about defying the oppression that had sunk its claws into his home, into his city, into the heart of France. That determination, young as it was, led him into the underworld of the resistance, a world that would change him forever. In the early days of the occupation, before the networks of rebellion truly formed, Georges had wandered the streets of Paris with an unsettling curiosity. He had seen the leaflets, printed with words that promised revolt, resistance, hope. At first, they were easy to dismiss, just pieces of paper blowing in the wind. But then, one evening, he saw something that caught his attention. A man in a dark coat, standing in an alley, his hand raised like he was waiting for something. Georges, drawn to him by some strange, almost magnetic force, had approached. The man looked at him for a long moment before he handed him a small, crumpled piece of paper. A message passed quickly, silently. It was the beginning of everything. The resistance, like a pulse beneath the surface of everyday life, had quietly begun to rise. Georges didn't fully understand the scope of it then. All he knew was that there was something bigger than himself, something that carried the weight of his lost brothers, his country, his future. He had no official training, no badge to wear, no grand speech to guide him. He was simply a boy, too young to fight, but desperate enough to find a way to help. His heart raced as he realized the significance of the task he had just been given, carrying a message, one that could save lives or cost him his own. The next few days were a blur of quick exchanges, whispered instructions, and shadowy figures. Georges was learning fast, faster than he had ever anticipated. He was entrusted with the most dangerous of duties, delivering messages between different cells of the resistance. But those first days were not filled with the romanticism of a hero's journey. Instead, they were marked by a suffocating, ever-present fear that clung to every moment. Every time he passed a German patrol, his heart would skip a beat, the terror of discovery gnawing at him. He had seen the cruel efficiency with which the Nazis dealt with even the smallest infraction. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and the punishment would be swift and brutal. There were moments, fleeting but intense, when he questioned what he was doing. He was so young, barely out of childhood, and yet here he was playing a role far beyond his years. He had no formal training, no sense of military strategy. His only weapon was his courage, and it often felt like that wasn't enough. But the war was not patient. It did not wait for the old to be ready, for the world to stop spinning long enough for the right time to arrive. It took what it wanted when it wanted it, and so Georges had no choice but to carry on, driven by something deeper than fear, a sense of duty that burned brighter than his terror. But even more than the fear, there was the paradox of it all. He, a child, was carrying the fate of so many grown men. He was the one who could slip through the cracks, who could move unnoticed in a way that adults could not. The Germans, in their arrogance, failed to notice the children who moved like ghosts through their occupied city, carrying secrets that would chip away at the very foundations of their control. In a sense, Georges was the silent weapon in their war, a messenger, a symbol, a tool whose value had been underestimated. Yet, as the days wore on, he began to realize just how much more was at stake. This wasn't just about delivering messages or passing on information. It was about survival. It was about holding on to something more precious than his own life: hope. Every time he made it back to his safe house without being caught, every time he saw the weary faces of his fellow resistance fighters, he understood that he was part of something much larger than himself. He was no longer a boy lost in the chaos. He was a piece of a puzzle that could break the enemy's hold on Paris. But there was always the fear of the inevitable. Georges wasn't naive enough to think he would escape this war unscathed. He knew the stakes, knew that the next time he might not make it back. The German patrols were getting smarter, more aggressive. One wrong move, one missed signal, and it could all come crashing down. And yet, there was a strange comfort in that. Perhaps it was the same kind of reckless bravery that had once filled the hearts of his brothers, or the same kind of pride that had led them to fight in the first place. The knowledge that he was doing something that mattered, that in the smallest of ways, he was making a difference. In the dead of night, he would slip out of his apartment, always looking over his shoulder, his senses heightened. The message in his pocket felt like a weight that was both comforting and crushing. He knew the consequences of being caught. The Gestapo had methods for dealing with resistance members, methods that left nothing behind. Georges had heard the stories from the older fighters, the ones who had been tortured and disappeared. But still, the desire to act, to resist, pushed him forward. What else could he do? How could he live with himself if he did nothing at all? It was on one of these nightly errands that Georges learned just how thin the line was between survival and death. He had just delivered a message to a group of partisans hiding in the back of a small cafe, their faces masked with anxiety. The usual exchange was quick, and he was ready to leave when the sound of approaching footsteps made his heart drop into his stomach. The door flung open, and there they were, 2 German soldiers, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. Georges froze, the panic rushing through him, but somehow he found his legs moving. He slipped out the back door, his breath ragged as he ran through the dark alleys of Paris, his mind racing. What would have happened if he had been caught? Would they have killed him on the spot? Or worse, would they have taken him alive to extract every piece of information he knew? That night, as he lay awake, his pulse still pounding in his ears, Georges understood the true nature of what he had become a part of. It was no longer just about messages or bravery. It was about survival, about being in a war that demanded everything of you, even your very childhood. And for the first time, he understood the cost of what he was doing. It was not just his life on the line. It was the lives of countless others, each of them a small part of something that could, one day, change the world. But for now, it was just him, alone, a boy too young to fight, but too defiant to give in. Georges couldn't afford to dwell on that uncertainty. He had work to do, and in a war, there was no room for fear, only for courage. January 12th, 1942. Lyon, France. The city was cloaked in the bitter chill of winter, the cold biting through the thin layers of clothing Georges had on. He wasn't used to this city, not like Paris, where the streets were a part of him, where he had once walked with his brothers. Here, in the heart of occupied France, everything felt foreign, dangerous, but also exhilarating in ways he hadn't anticipated. Lyon was a place of secrets, of whispers that drifted through the alleyways like smoke, elusive, and almost forgotten by those who didn't know to listen. But for Georges, it had become home, in the way a temporary hiding place becomes a refuge when survival is all that matters. His role in the resistance had shifted since those early days in Paris. He wasn't just running messages anymore. He was an integral part of a much larger, much more complex network. The resistance had evolved from a disjointed collection of isolated groups into a well-organized machine, and Georges had found himself at the center of that transformation. The messages he carried were more than just words now. They were lifelines. Information about troop movements, about supply lines, about the places where the Germans were weakest. Each letter, each scrap of paper, held the potential to save lives or to condemn them. And Georges was carrying it all, his hands trembling with the weight of the responsibility. He had become indispensable to the cause, not just because of his age, but because of his remarkable ability to blend into the shadows. His youth, once seen as a disadvantage, had become his greatest asset. The Germans didn't see him as a threat, not like they would have seen a grown man or a trained soldier. He was just a boy, and because of that, he could move through the streets of Lyon with a freedom that no adult could. He had learned how to disappear into the city's labyrinth of narrow streets and hidden courtyards, how to use the shadows to his advantage. He had become a ghost, invisible to those who were looking for something or someone far more dangerous. But despite the growing sense of usefulness, Georges felt the tension mounting around him. The war was closing in from every direction. The Germans were tightening their grip on France, and the resistance, despite its growing network, was always under threat of exposure. There were whispers of betrayal, of spies infiltrating the cells from within. Trust had become a commodity more precious than food or ammunition. And yet, in the midst of all the fear and the danger, Georges had found something else, something that both frightened and inspired him. He had found camaraderie. He wasn't alone in his mission. Over the past few months, he had met other young people, girls and boys, barely older than he was, all carrying messages just like him. They were a forgotten army, one that the Germans would never have taken seriously. They worked in the shadows, moving between cells with such speed and efficiency that it seemed like they had become part of the very fabric of the city. They were the ones who passed information between the resistance groups, who organized the underground efforts to sabotage German operations, who made sure the voices of the oppressed still had a way to be heard. They were the unsung heroes of the war, the ones who wouldn't be remembered in history books, but whose efforts were vital to the survival of the cause. One of them was Claire, a girl Georges had met shortly after arriving in Lyon. She was barely 18, but there was a quiet strength to her, a steeliness in her eyes that reminded Georges of his brothers. She had the same kind of determination, the same burning sense of justice that had driven him to join the resistance. They had become partners of sorts, working together to pass along messages, to scout out new routes for their operations. They were a team, and in the midst of all the chaos, that sense of partnership was what kept Georges going. But Claire was different from the others. She had a sharp mind, one that saw things not just in terms of the immediate risks, but also in the long-term picture. She could see the bigger picture, the way all the small actions of the resistance were coming together to form something larger, something that could take down the Nazi occupation from the inside out. Georges had learned a great deal from Claire in the short time they had worked together. She taught him how to move with purpose, how to think beyond the immediate task, how to anticipate what the Germans might do next. But what Georges admired most about her was her ability to stay calm under pressure. There was a confidence in the way she spoke, in the way she handled herself, that made Georges trust her implicitly. He could feel his own resolve strengthening in her presence, his determination to see this through to the end. One evening, as they were walking through the cold streets of Lyon, a tension heavier than the winter air settled over them. There had been a rumor that a large group of German soldiers was planning to sweep through the resistance strongholds in the city. Claire had received word that they were targeting the very group they were working with. The mission, now more than ever, was critical. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they neared the building where they were supposed to meet with a contact, Georges' heart began to race. He could sense that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Claire must have sensed it too, because her pace slowed, her eyes scanning their surroundings. The streets of Lyon were eerily quiet, too quiet. It was as if the entire city held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Georges' fingers brushed against the crumpled letter in his pocket, the one he was supposed to deliver. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make both of them freeze in place. Footsteps, heavy boots crunching on the snow, the unmistakable sound of German soldiers. Without a word, Claire grabbed Georges' arm and pulled him into the nearest alley. They pressed themselves against the cold stone of the building, hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. Georges' breath caught in his throat as he realized they were too close to escape. His mind raced. What would they do if they were caught? Would they shoot them on the spot? Would they torture them for information? He could feel his hands shaking, but he forced himself to stay still, to remain calm. This was no time for fear. This was what they had been training for. This was the life they had chosen. The soldiers passed by without noticing them, their eyes scanning the street ahead, oblivious to the two young resistance members pressed against the wall, hidden in plain sight. As the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, Georges exhaled, his breath a cloud in the cold air. He looked at Claire, who gave him a quick nod of reassurance. "We need to move," she whispered, her voice steady. "We can't afford to waste any more time." They continued on, the tension from the close call still hanging in the air. But as they approached their destination, Georges couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something much worse than just a brush with the enemy. They had narrowly escaped death itself, and they both knew it. The war was closing in, and no one, least of all them, could escape its reach forever. Later that night, after they had successfully delivered the message and made their way back to the resistance safe house, Georges lay awake in his cot, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in his mind, the fear, the close call, the overwhelming realization that this was the reality of their lives now. Every day was a risk. Every moment could be their last. But even in the midst of that danger, Georges felt something stir within him. A sense of purpose, a feeling that, despite everything, they were making a difference. The resistance wasn't just a group of people fighting for freedom. It was a lifeline, a thread of hope woven into the fabric of a broken world. And as long as he had that, as long as he could be a part of something that mattered, he would keep going. Because in the end, that was the only thing that could keep him from being swallowed by the darkness.